Hi, Misha here, and this is a video I've really been wanting to do on the U-2. And no, not the Irish band. Haven't quite got into the music reviewing yet, mostly because I don't know how to do it without upsetting YouTube. No, the high altitude reconnaissance, aka spy aircraft, because we finally have a model in 172 scale diecast thanks to Hobbymaster. As far as I know, this is the first one to exist in this type and scale. I've only seen these in 144 and even 1/200 in the past. I'm sure there's some plastic models, but in diecast. In the past, we've looked at these. This is the Lockheed SR-71 Blackbird. This model is from Century Wings, and actually, this is a version that just came out earlier this year. And here we have one that came out just a couple months ago. This is an MQ-1 Predator, General Atomics, which is one of the coolest names for an aircraft company. And this is from Air Force One. And these are definitely worth comparing to the U-2 because both of them, along with the Global Hawk, have tried replacing the U-2 quite unsuccessfully. Now, I'm not going to go too much into the history in this video because I want to kind of focus on the model, but of course you know I have to talk about it some. So with that, we'll jump into it and put it on the spinny thing. And here we have it. Quite an impressively large, although light model, very much taking after the aircraft itself. This has a very interesting history and, part, piece, whatever in history. It's in a lot of ways a response to Pearl Harbor. That was a sneak attack, a surprise, at least unless you buy into some of the conspiracy stuff anyway, and which some of it's kind of true. But regardless, the official record was the Pearl Harbor attack was a surprise. And with the Soviet Union being the new adversary, the CIA, the Air Force, the American government realized they really didn't have any good data collection. They had reconnaissance craft that would do nearby flybys and whatnot of the comm block, but the Iron Curtain was coming down hard by 1948. And by 1950, Russia was getting very aggressive with air defense. They had new MiG fighters, they had anti-aircraft guns, and they had a new generation of missiles that would be coming on the scene in a short time. There was a study in 51-52, and what they discovered, although it was not widely known, is that the Soviets had perhaps better radar than Britain and America. At least it was better at detecting things at high altitude. This led to the notion that we needed an aircraft capable of flying over 65,000 feet altitude. That might sound high today, but in 1953, aircraft struggled to even make it over 40,000 feet, and at the time, no production aircraft was doing much over 50,000 feet, and even then, not successfully for very long. So this was a pretty tall order to go 65, 70,000 feet. It would also need a camera system able to take high resolution photos that high up. And they actually started working on the camera system before the aircraft. That was around 1954. The aircraft proposal, the Air Force wanted, and CIA would kind of get involved too, it needed to be able to basically be a reconnaissance aircraft at high altitude, and they wanted smaller companies to take a stab at it because they could focus on the design more. Bell, Martin, and Fairchild were kind of selected and submitted prototypes. Lockheed was not invited, but they heard about what was going on, and Lockheed pushing the envelope, and they had just the man for it, Clarence or Kelly Johnson, who at that time was working on the new F-104, which would become the Starfighter. And he had very good success in the past about delivering things on time and on budget. So the owners of Lockheed put him in charge in his skunk works to develop something for this Air Force proposal. And in summer of 54, the Air Force took a look at what he was cooking and said, no thanks. They didn't like that it was a single engine. They didn't like the very unique landing gear arrangement and some other things. However, the CIA, they liked it. They liked the fact that it kind of had a sailplane or glider style of wing, very big. They liked the fact that it was a single engine. At the time, it would have been the J-57. And the landing gear arrangement really didn't bother them. We'll talk more about that in a minute when we look at some pieces for this model. So the CIA was more interested than the Air Force. And that really led to a partnership in late 54. And so Lockheed would get a contract for 20 of these for the CIA to be built. And they agreed to deliver the first prototype in the summer of 55 and to have the full batch done before the end of 1956. So they had their work cut out for them. And they succeeded. They delivered the first prototype in July of 1955, by which time the Air Force was kind of warming towards it. This is when it received the U-2 designation, U for utility. That's what the Air Force called it. The CIA called these articles. And an arrangement was worked out where there would kind of be a joint system between the Air Force and the CIA. A lot of times it would be former Air Force pilots, although not always, flying these, but they would have to go through sheep dipping, basically resigning their commissions to join the CIA to fly these. And that had a lot to do with the president. Eisenhower, the ball was kind of batted back and forth. Should the Air Force or the CIA do these? And for various political and some military reasons, it was decided that the CIA would fly these. But the Air Force would help recruit, train pilots, that kind of thing. Whereas the CIA would actually work on the reconnaissance part, collecting, developing photographs, setting up bases in foreign countries, negotiating those kinds of deals, and of course, setting up cover stories, which this plane had several over the years. And it really ended up being a clandestine plane. But it was a very unique plane, so much so that they had to buy new areas to test these in. One such area you might have heard of, Groom Lake, aka Area 51. Yeah, the whole thing got started in the mid-50s because of the U-2. So yeah, the first aircraft was delivered in July, and on August 1st, they were doing a full power taxi test. And because of the sailplane wings, it inadvertently took to the air. Taking off was easy that day. Too easy. Landing, because they weren't really planning for it, was more difficult. But they got her back down with minor damage. And they had the first intentional test flight a couple of days later. And then on September 8th, 1955, this first reached its altitude of 65,000 feet. Later that would be pushed to 70,000 and 72,000 for the earliest versions. And so, yeah, and Lockheed is still delivering the first batch. These would be the U-2As with the J-57 engine. A little underpowered, especially that. But they would do the job. The U-2B was never really put into production. It was just a concept. The U-2C, which would become famous in 1960, had an uprated J-75 engine, and they had to alter the air intakes a bit for that. But this is actually a U-2S. We'll get there in time. But with that, yeah, let's talk about some of the features of this here diecast model. To begin with, we have standard Hobby Master features. Gear up or down. A stand. I do like the stand for this one. It's the wide base style, and it has the metal stem, and it actually plugs into a slot instead of cradling it. These tend to be very stable, which is good because of the wide wingspan. It's probably going to get knocked a bit. It's wide but light. And open or close canopy. They even put a little kind kind of rear view mirror looking thing here. And our pilot, they did correctly. He's not a standard pilot. He's in the special flight suit that these used. Essentially, it was a space suit. It was a pressurized suit because these were flying at such high altitudes. In fact, the pilots had to breathe 100% oxygen an hour or two before their flight to get all the nitrogen out of their blood. And they were sealed up. Sometimes the flights would be 8-9 hours. So there was a kind of a seal, a hole that could be sealed up, a self-sealing hole that they could drink liquids through or even eat food through tubes. A lot of technology that would soon carry over to the Mercury and Gemini programs, and kind of started here. Not flying high enough to consider them astronauts, a lot of that tech was started and continues today. Obviously, there's no ordnance in this because this aircraft was a sensor aircraft, or is, I should say. It had regular cameras, wet film. It had air sensors. It had radar for censoring. Had all kinds of sensor stuff. And several spaces to stick it. There was a bay behind the pilot in the fuselage. The nose had plenty of room for stuff. And the wings could carry different elements. Now, I say plenty of room. That's relatively speaking. This is a very cramped aircraft, to be honest with you. When I was even putting my little pilot in, he fits, but yeah, there's not really much room, especially with his bulky suit. So not the most comfortable thing. He also had a lot to do. Because this was designed for a high-altitude aircraft, the controls, well, they were fine at over 60,000 feet, but under that, they were pretty aggressive. They weren't powered. You had to manually force them. That took a lot of physical energy and mental energy. He also had to operate the cameras. Yeah, he's kind of alone in here. So it was mentally and physically taxing. And so it took the best of the best to fly these, and they even had to resign their military commissions to do so. So you have to give credit where credit was due there. The body of the aircraft is all metal. The wings. The nose is polymer because of the angle, and these tanks are partially polymer. There's actually a good reason for that. Our tail is metal. In fact, all three planes are metal. So it does have some weight to it. The original aircraft was about 103 feet wide because of the wings and 63 feet long. It was designed for high altitude, though, not speed. In fact, its top speed was under 500 miles per hour, and it had a cruise speed of about 470. But it had duration, it had endurance, it had good range for the time, and again, it had very advanced cameras designed to take pictures way high up. But again, the model actually does have a few options that are kind of interesting. Let's take a look. The reason these are partially polymer is that the units are replaceable for different versions. It comes with these two smaller ends that you can slot on to give more of an early U-2 appearance. Again, this model is of a 2015 U-2S. But if you're going for earlier, you could use these. It even comes with a third, it's still in my bag here, that has what looks to be a probe on there. Anyone know, is that a pitot tube or is that a refueling probe? I'm not sure. Just one of those, because you would just need one. In addition, we get the landing gear. Very unique arrangement. It did not use a tricycle style or even the old World War I style. It actually has bicycle style. There are a total of 4 wheels here, 2 in front, 2 in back. That's actually something, like I said, the Air Force didn't really care for. And then for takeoff, they had these small wheels here on sticks called pogos that would snap onto the wings and then fall off once the aircraft took flight. And they would reattach them after it landed so it could taxi back. So these are just little things there for stabilizing the wing. Here's our canopy. If you would like to display it open, as you notice, it would hinge to the side, not open clamshell. So yeah, a few options there for display. Over here we have the cover for the stand slot if you don't want to have it on the stand. We also have air brakes here. These can be open. This is the two you can plug in for open. For mine, I have it in the closed position back here. It's weird, they fit loose, but they also don't fall out. Other one's over here. So you can display those open or closed, gear up or down, pogos on or off, canopy open or closed, pilot in or out, or even change up the wing configuration if you wish. So hey, since this is issue 1 from Hobby Master, not a bad first effort in my opinion. Then again, I'm just thrilled to have it because it matches my SR-71 and Predator from earlier this year. Neat little set together. After the CIA kind of proved that this was a good design, in 1956 the Air Force decided to purchase 30 or some of their own using the CIA as a middleman. And this would be where the name Dragon Lady comes from. That's not the official name of the aircraft, but that was the project name the Air Force started it under. And from there we have all kinds of historical events. The first overflight of a comm-block nation, which was actually Poland, was in June of '56. And then in July, there would be the first couple of overflights of the Soviet Union. This would lead the diplomatic staff. There was a bunch of back and forth. These would first be used in Southeast Asia, flying out of Japan in '58. And it was a lot of back and forth, but of course the most famous incident was May 1st, 1960, with Gary Powers. This was actually supposed to be the last flight, of course, in the Soviet Union, and he got caught. They thought if the aircraft ever were to be shot down, it would just break apart and the pilot would probably be killed. But because of the wing design, it actually came down somewhat intact, and Powers was more or less unharmed and was more or less treated decently in the Soviet Union. He was put on trial and found guilty because he was a spy. But even though he had a long prison sentence, he was given decent accommodations and was released back to the U.S. just 2 years later during a prisoner exchange. So his story ended in Russia reasonably. Much better than it could have. But that was a huge international incident, as you would imagine. So they didn't do overflights with Russia after that. But in '62, during the Cuban Missile Crisis between October 14 and the end of the situation, there would be lots of overflights of Cuba with these. Major Anderson would take some of the first pictures of Russian missiles in Cuba, but unfortunately he was shot down on October 27th, and unlike Powers, he lost his life. Less of an international incident, but also more of a stern warning from Khrushchev that, what if they mistook it for a bomber, not a reconnaissance aircraft? That could have started World War III. That gave a lot of people kind of second thoughts. Nevertheless, they did start to fly U-2s over Vietnam that year, and then after the Gulf of Tonkin in '64, Strategic Air Command, SAC, kind of took over operations in the theater. And these would continue to fly. There would be one loss under combat conditions in 1966, but the pilot, Major Stewart, would eject safely over South Vietnam. Unfortunately, where his plane came down, that was Viet Cong-controlled territory, so an Army Special Forces team had to be sent in with demolition charges to blow up his aircraft. So that classified sensors and information would not leak. But it would continue to operate there, but not just there. Back to the 50s, these would be flown in the Middle East, kind of looking to see what Egypt was up to, but also Israel. Israel was a prime target, even up through 1970, and kind of looking at tensions there. The RAF would also fly some U-2s. Taiwan would fly a few. And they would continue to improve the design. The U-2F would be the aerial refueling version. Then there would be the U-2R, which had a larger fuselage and more tankage and newer sensors. That would be introduced around 67, 68. And that would actually lead to the immediate predecessor of this version here, the U-2R third production batch, or the TR-1A as it was known for a time. These were all built in the 1980s. They would build, I think, 33 of them, with the last one delivered to the Air Force at the end of 1989. Now later, the A's and the C's would be retired, but the R's and the TR-1As would be upgraded to become the U-2S here. And yet again, they would get a new engine. This would be the General Dynamics F-118. They would get a GPS system. They would get new sensors. And just kind of standardize the fleet. And depending on which source you read, they updated and standardized between 31 and 32 of these for the Air Force. And they were the lower flat-hour versions of the aircraft. So why is it still in service today when we have the SR-71 and the drones and stuff? Well, because it does things that they and satellites can't. Let's put the SR-71, the Blackbird, on the stand, although you'll forgive me if I don't spin it as much. It is very long. This is a much longer model because it's a much longer aircraft. It's over 107 feet in real life, although its wingspan is under 56 feet. That's because with this, they were kind of going for early stealth. The U-2 wasn't quite as invulnerable as they thought. They figured the Russian radar might be able to detect these 65, 70,000 feet, but not shoot one down. But those new missiles could do just that, and even later, some fighter jets like the MiG-25 could threaten the U-2. And while it had good endurance, 8-9 hours, it was quite slow, only about 3/4 of Mach speed at top speed and cruising closer to half that. So, yeah, they decided to maybe replace it in the late 50s, or at least kind of supplement it. And as I said, it was kind of hard on the pilot, having him do everything. So in the late 50s, they again kind of turned to Kelly Johnson and Skunk Works. Starting with their A-10 design, they worked out the A-12, the Archangel, which they did put into limited production, building a baker's dozen of them, and even into service throughout the mid-60s. But that's where the RS-71 got started. And yes, it was RS-71 in the beginning, but it was soon renamed in 64-65 to SR-71. This was to try to address the deficiencies of the U-2. We have a crew of 2. Now the pilot can focus on being a pilot. We have a guy in the back for manning the equipment. This is not just supersonic, but supersonic. 2,200 miles plus an hour. So that's over Mach 3.2, 3.3. And whereas the U-2 liked operating at high altitudes, the SR-71 liked operating at high speeds. And it had a higher altitude. Originally, the U-2's max altitude was about 72,000 feet, at least operationally. Later versions like the TR-1 and the U-2S could go higher, in fact, over 80,000 feet. The SR-71, though, higher still from the beginning, 85,000 feet. That was because of a new engine, and well, two engines, and just, and they did have some stealth kind of built into the design. It's not a stealth aircraft, but yeah. So it was a more advanced aircraft. First flew in 64, was in limited service by 66, and full service by 68. But it had drawbacks. It was a lot more intensive to fly, a lot more expensive. Had a crew of 2 instead of 1 you had to worry about. And the whole fuel situation was interesting, to say the least. Luckily, these, of course, had to be aerial refueled, so they were. But for everything it brought to the table, it also complicated things quite a bit. They only built 32 of these. And that's compared to the U-2's 104 that have been built. The SR-71 also has about half the range endurance of the U-2, at least unless you aerially refuel it. If you refuel it, you can keep it up for a very long time. But that requires other aircraft. So yeah, that is why, after using it throughout the 70s and 80s, the Air Force retired it for the first time in 1988. However, Congress kind of forced them to keep half a dozen or so in reserve just in case. And that turned out to be one of the few smart political moves Washington, D.C. has made in recent years, because they noticed the absence of the SR-71 in the Gulf War. So they were essentially reactivated briefly in the mid-90s with some upgrades, including a new data link and GPS. But both Congress and the President were against this. Again, changing times, changing politics. And so the Air Force would ground the SR-71 for a final time in 1998. Now, NASA flew both of these. In fact, Hobbymaster is releasing a NASA version of the U-2. But they themselves retired their SR-71 in 1999. So these are mothballed. So even though it might have potentially replaced the U-2, it didn't. The U-2 has already outstripped it by more than 2 decades. In fact, the U-2 is kind of legendary for being one of a very few aircraft to serve in the U.S. Air Force for half a century. Of course, the B-52 is another one, and Lockheed's own C-130. So it definitely has its place in the history books. So what about unmanned drones? Well, the Predator started off known as the RQ-1 for reconnaissance, remote controlled, unmanned. Now the MQ-1, when they added a couple of Hellfire missiles. Yeah, this project started in the late 80s. The first prototypes were tested in 94, and the first kind of test flights were in 95 and 96. And by the 21st century in the War on Terror, they became more and more common. The Air Force and CIA both operated the U-2. The Air Force was the only operator of the SR-71. And again, here we have a joint project to some extent between the Air Force and the CIA. But other branches actually were interested in various drone models, the Navy, the Army. And it had, of course, a lot to recommend it. It was cheaper to build. In fact, they built over 360 of these, so more than 3 times that of the U-2 and 10 times SR-71. You weren't risking pilots, and you could put a lot of sensors. And as you see, of the 3, this is the only one that was actually ever armed for real combat situations. But there were obvious detractions. It took a crew of 3 to operate these on the ground. And this is a propeller-driven aircraft. The benefit, these can fly for a long time. They are capable of aerial refueling, at least some of them. The longest recorded mission publicly acknowledged is 40 hours, although 24 is a more common duration. So it can stay on station a long time. But because of its propellerness, its speed is basically that of a car, maybe a little bit faster. Top speed is about 130, 135 miles per hour, but cruising speed, just hanging around speed, is between 70 and 80 miles per hour. Also, its maximum altitude is only about 25,000 feet, so nothing like the other two aircraft. And because of its nature, it has a much more limited range than either the SR-71. Actually, its range is about 1/9 of that of the U-2S. So it has its limitations, but it also has its benefits. But it was hoped that the Global Hawk could replace the U-2 since the SR-71 didn't work out, and that has yet to happen. The U-2 has been on the chopping block a few times, but it's made it this far. So let's talk about why. Believe it or not, one reason is cost. From the very beginning, this was a pretty cost-effective aircraft. Remember how I said that Kelly Johnson was known for bringing things in on time and on budget? Well, with this, he failed. He actually delivered it under budget. He saved $3.5 million. And in 1950s dollars, that was a lot. Too bad that doesn't happen these days. And while, of course, it's not inexpensive to operate, it's much cheaper to operate per hour than the SR-71, and believe it or not, cheaper to operate per hour than the Predator. At least up until newer versions of the Predator have been introduced. So that's kept it around. I think the reasons: it has more range, more endurance than the other two. And the pilot workload is still heavy, but they seem to take pride in that. And with newer versions, we have over-the-horizon data link. We've got side-looking radar now, the GPS. A few things have helped. We also have more tank storage and a more powerful engine, which has made the coffin corner kind of a thing of the past. That was a early problem with them in the 60s of the difference between max speed and stall speed at altitude was tiny, making them a little difficult to keep right in that sweet spot. But with the newer R's and S's, they've kind of resolved some issues with these. And it's become such an iconic piece of American history. One fun thing, these still use wet photography. They still develop pictures taken with these. They don't use digital, at least not all the time, because digital has a certain resolution wall you hit where things become pixelated, or so I'm told. With the analog photography of the U-2, they can really zoom in and examine more. So in some ways, it's still using 1950s technology, but of course it has been upgraded over time. So yeah, these were kind of on the chopping block in the late 80s. They were talking about retiring them, and they got pretty serious after the last ones were delivered, and then the end of the Cold War. 2004, 2005, 2006, as more and more drones were becoming available, Congress is kind of pushing for it. The Air Force pushed back, and in the end, they won out. The retirement date has been pushed back many times, and in fact, upgrade and update programs, as recently as last year, 2020, have been approved for these. They received new cockpit displays, some revising to the engines, and next they're going to upgrade some of the sensors and whatnot on board. They've also improved the ECM suite, the electronic countermeasures for safety. So yeah, they're still upgrading these, and there's even plans to have a new upgrade program beginning next year, 2022. Lockheed has examined, or now Lockheed Martin, has examined the fleet of 30 some odd that the Air Force still operates. The CIA no longer operates the U-2. But Lockheed said that the fleet is still quite young, that has a lot of hours left on the frame. And that's just it. The SR-71 was kind of a brute force plane, putting a lot of wear and tear. The U-2, because of its kind of sailplane or glider nature and relatively low speeds, isn't a particularly stressed airframe, at least, compared to a lot of others. So they have a pretty good expectancy for service life, making them, yet again, more efficient to operate. So it'll be interesting to see just how long these stick around. despite their shortcomings, they still have a lot to offer, and that's why they've been used in Iraq, Afghanistan. They were used to help with the no-fly zone in 2011 over Libya. They've been used for supporting various operations in Syria, and probably will be continued for a long time. And you might also think, well, what about satellites? Well, they definitely have advantages, but satellites have a predetermined course and track, and they have to worry about orbital mechanics. And at least back in the olden days, they had to deliver canisters of film back to Earth, and then they were kind of no longer useful. Now, of course, in modern time, they're digital. So satellites have their place, but they're not as flexible. The nice thing about a U-2 flight, it can be changed very quickly, even after it takes off sometimes, if that's practical. So they can make last-minute changes, course corrections, they can reassign targets, and the film can get delivered for processing very quickly. So, yeah, they still have some advantages over satellites, and they work well in conjunction with satellites, and they work well in conjunction with various drones, too, because they have their purpose in place as well, especially in not risking human lives. The U-2 doesn't have a perfect safety record. Several have been lost in accidents because of what it is, but frankly, percentage-wise, it's better than the SR-71. Of the 32 71s built, 12 were lost in crashes, accidents, but luckily 11, well, I should say not 11, but only one pilot was lost, and that was a test flight. The others ejected safely. So, yeah, and with the improvements of the S program, higher altitude and whatnot, the U-2 is plenty effective for what it is, which is pretty damn surprising. All three of these models have come out this year, 2021, and I could not be happier with them, and they make a neat little fleet. The SR-71, I had an Air Force One version, and it was well done, but the nice thing about the Century wings, their tooling is very closely related to Hobbymaster, so they have the same features, open and closed canopies, removable pilot figures. It has the slotted in stand. If I had one complaint, it has a plastic stand. I wish it were metal because it is a little wiggly wobbly on the stand, which scares me every time. But it is a nice one, and overall I like it more than the Air Force One, although I think the Air Force One might be a little bit heavier. They have pros and cons, frankly. But I do like the Air Force One Predator. This kind of plays to the company's strengths, because it doesn't have opening canopy or pilot to be removed. That doesn't really come across as missing. And whereas some Air Force Ones, the gear can only be down, this is up or down. It comes with an all-metal stand, has a spinning propeller. The plane itself is all metal, and you can either have it with the missiles on the wings or not. So very happy with this, and this is quite a bit less expensive than the others. And the Hobbymaster, well, again, they're doing something with the U-2 that not only have they not done before, but no one has done before. And for a first release, I think they did a pretty darn good job, and I'm looking forward to the next ones. Again, this is U-2S from 2015. They're also planning on doing some U-2Rs. I haven't seen any sign of like a U-2A or C yet, but with the whole Gary Powers thing, I have no doubt that they will do a 1960 Gary Powers edition. And hopefully they'll do a Major Anderson edition too, just as, tribute for the missile crisis type thing. So let me know what you think of the U-2, of these. Like I said, this is one that's been a long time in coming, and a lot of people have been anticipating this model, so I wanted to do a thorough review and just talk about the really cool history. With that, I appreciate you tuning in. Please feel free to comment, like, share, subscribe. And this is Misha, and I'll catch you very soon next time.